very grateful for Oli to come along this evening. He's a professor of human geography at Royal Holloway College, University of London, and his academic research and his writing focuses on the role of creativity, urban creativity, on activism and politics. And he has described himself as a Christianicist, and he's talking this evening about his book, 7 Ethics Against Capitalism. So the format of this evening is going to be that Oli will talk for maybe 20, 30 minutes. I've got some questions I've already thought about to ask Oli. And if you have a question, and I hope there will be questions that you'd want to put to him, please use the chat function, because there's quite a lot of people, so it's difficult to pick up on who wants to ask a question. Please put your questions in the chat function, and I or Kat, when she arrives, will be able to pick up questions that you're asking. So, Oli, thank you again for coming. We're glad you're back to hopefully full good health, and over to you.
Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation. And again, apologies it had to be postponed. I was very much out for the count last time round. So I published this book not that long ago, although it seems like an age ago, 2001, I think it was. And I must admit, John's review, I think, in one of his blogs was really stirring and fantastic. And so I really thank him for reaching out and asking me to talk. What I'm going to do is I've got some text which I'm going to read, which I think will outline the book fairly well. And the accompanying slides do a job, sometimes esoterically, I think, of describing what I'm saying. I like to use art pieces to describe. My vicar in my church is an art historian, and he's constantly using paintings and Renaissance images to color his talks. I don't go back that far in time. I've used far more contemporary stuff, but suffice to say, some of it might be relevant, some of it a bit more ephemerally so. Anyway, so I think really there's never been a more pressing time, I think, to not only theorize but indeed practice what we would describe as anti-capitalism. The half a millennium, if you like, of rampant imperialist kind of mercantilism has mutated into a global capitalism, and indeed over the last decade or so has morphed into quite a dangerous fascistic form of kind of national wealth generation. And for me and many people like me, I think it's proved beyond any reasonable doubt that capitalism does irrevocable damage to the planet, to the climate, to biodiversity, to democracy, and indeed to us as a species. I don't think it can be tweaked. I think it needs to be moved on completely. So while being an anti-capitalist might ring kind of alarm bells for some as being quite radical, and you hear it as a phrase which the government don't like and they put it on lists of banned phrases and everything else, I think it's actually the most rational course of action for everybody, because capitalism is just so destructive. So to be against it is, I think, very, very important and actually rational. But where can we begin? It seems so all-consuming that any resistance to it just, seems futile. But I think that luckily the answers lie all around us. They're just scattered, they're hidden, and they're diffuse. Right the way back from human prehistory, really, through capitalism's growth and all the failed revolutions of the past, the very real ideology of the commons has remained. And that's where the book is actually, despite saying against capitalism, the subtitle is very important, towards a planetary commons. Now, there's lots of different ways in which we can describe that, and I don't really have time to go into the planetary detail of it, although maybe we can pick that up later. But fundamentally, the idea of the commons is a very important one, academically and politically. But fundamentally, it's the idea of the commons is that which we build by simply being together. So it's more than just a natural resource. It's more than just a forest, a lake, a field, or some of the ways in which perhaps the UN or the World Health Organization or some of the International Monetary Fund, for example, might describe something like a planetary common or a common pool resource. While that's important, I think the commons is the community that builds up around and beyond it. It's the society that is created and the continual act of democratizing access and sharing the gifts of that resource to those who need it and use it the most. So in the book, I build on the work of an anthropologist, a guy called Stephen Goodman, and some geographers. I'm a geographer, so I read their work a lot. J.K. Gibson Graham, that's their pen name, there's two of them. And through their work, the commons is thought of less as a unitary or a singular protected natural resource, as I say, such as a rainforest or a pasture or irrigation system. And more of a symbiotic relationship between a resource and the community that it creates. Without thinking common resources as being of the community, the commons as an ideology, what happens to it just becomes threatened by enclosure. And we see this a lot with some of the World Bank's management of the Amazon rainforest, for example, that they kind of guard access to it and it suddenly just becomes depleted. So for these people and for me, a commons does not exist until a resource is overlaid with a community of people and indeed things, which I'll get onto, that freely access it. So Stephen Goodman, he has a wonderful quote, and he says that taking away the commons destroys community, and destroying a complex set of relations demolishes a commons. So seeing the commons as a kind of dialectic relationship, if you like, is really important between commons and the community. And I think it redefines both of those things when we look at it that way. So now in 2023, I think it's an idea whose time has come. But how do we get there? How do we push this idea of the commons into what is seemingly a kind of suffocating capitalism? Well, I think that there's lots of philosophical tools around us to do this, and the main one is the idea of an event or a rupture. Now, lots of revolutions in the past, the Haitian Revolution, Russian, and everything else, they use this idea of an event, of a rupture, which again, I don't particularly want to go into the philosophy of it, although again, if you're interested, we can. It's all in the book. But to maintain the progressiveness, if you like, of a rupture, which is often a lot of that emancipation pushing through the status quo, producing a commons is to not let it sort of scab over, if you like, with existing inequalities, or indeed something far worse. And that process is called being ethical. So again, it's a very specific idea of ethics, something I take from Gilles Deleuze and other philosophers. So being ethical involves trying to maintain the kind of power of a rupture, of an event, or the power of of that particular kind of the progressiveness of that event, the politics of that event. So that's where this book is situated, and that event again is around COVID. And I think COVID is, we are still living through the aftershocks of it, and I think that it's still playing havoc with our economy, with our politics, with every single nature of our being. Think about, we're meeting on Zoom here. Before the pandemic, we might well have tried to meet together. We wouldn't even thought to have done it like this. So the pandemic, while it may be considered over for some, I think it's going to reverberate right through society and for a long, long time to come. So for me, the COVID is an event, and so which released a lot of really important things onto the world, really good things, which we need to try and keep hold of. A lot of bad things as well, but I think that there are some really good things which are already beginning to be attacked. And again, we can talk about that. So being ethical, I think, is about making sure that we keep hold of the good things and showing how they are progressive and how they can create a better society by pushing through. So that's what I mean by ethical. And throughout my research over the last 20 years or so, I've kind of boiled them down to 7. I think there's 7 kinds of ways of being ethical, because a lot of the philosophy around ethics, if you read Alain Badiou or Gilles Deleuze or even Spinoza, that idea of ethics can be quite vague. They don't really kind of ground it. And I really wanted to ground it because I thought it's a great idea, but I don't know how to do it. So I went about saying, okay, this is how I think you do it. So there are 7. So if you allow me the time, I'll just go through those 7 fairly quickly. So the first one is mutualism. And by the way, I gave them each one word. So the words can be quite long, but don't be put off by them. They're just my attempt to try and, I didn't want to have a phrase as an ethics. I wanted one word. So this idea of mutualism, I've done a lot of work recently on mutual aid, which I'm sure is a term that many of you may have heard of, and this is where it kind of comes from. So being mutual or mutualism is more than simply shunning individualism and the sort of Thatcher-led neoliberal sort of individualism which has come to pervade our society. It reaffirms the social. And I think that it even does more than that, okay? So it's about philosophically and empirically understanding that there is a sort of actually existing we. When we say we need to do this, we need to do that, I think we often gloss over, but who is the we? Now, I think that, as I say, in the book, I go into a lot of more detail, but there's neurological studies, for example, which suggest that we're actually inherently empathetic beings. I think that we have empathy actually hardwired into us. We have the capacity to be compassionate. And, being amongst fellow Christians, I can safely say that this, from a spiritual perspective, clearly we have that empathy kind of, I think, hardwired into us because we are made in the image of God. And we can look at recent studies in microbiology, for example, and they've shown that we are anything but individuals. We can contain a multiplicity of other organisms within us that are necessary for our survival. We're actually anything but self-contained individual. And again, I go into the science in the book. So I think that mutualism scales this outwards. We need to be radically connected and resist egoism, really resist selfishness. And what that does, it kind of disarms capitalism's trump card of offering personal wealth and stardom to perhaps rebellious or subversive people. And I think that there's lots of really interesting ways to do that. But a really great phrase that I've found, it actually emanates from a group of Bolivian anarcho-feminists, of all people, but it was put onto this piece of artwork by Adam Brumberg. And it says, "Be careful with each other so we can be dangerous together." And so for me, mutualism, I think, is one of the fundamental, if probably not the most fundamental ethic, because without it, activism just sort of fizzles out before it can start. The second is called transmaterialism, and I use the phrase trans deliberately in solidarity with the trans movement, which also kind of tries to break down binaries. So transmaterialism, it's this. So to be a consuming body is to be human, right? We have to consume stuff to survive. We need to eat, we need to live, we need to consume energy and everything else. Therefore, everything that we consume is considered non-human. That's what capitalism does. So the more and more things, and indeed people, so in the form of slavery, for example, and colonialism, and all the dehumanizing rhetoric that we're seeing at the moment with racism in Gaza and everything else, often people, as well as animals and things and everything else, are demoted to the level of non-human, and it is a demotion under capitalism. And that feeds this idea that capitalism dictates what an ideal kind of consuming body is. So the capitalism of the sort of Anthropocene which we're living in is an extractive machine. It dominates and it violates life, and it kind of dictates in real time what is human and what is non-human, and therefore to be sacrificed on the altar of profitability. So, for example, the conversion of sedimented dead organisms from millions of years ago into oil renders them subordinate to the needs of the consuming human. The life of the Amazon rainforest that is destroyed to make way for cattle grazing or palm oil plantations is deemed not worthy. Capitalism, like I say, therefore, it has a real-time dictation of what is human and what is non-human, who consumes and who is consumed. So transmaterialism, and like I said, I've used that term trans deliberately because of its agency in disrupting mutualisms. It's almost about leveling up, if you like, to use a sort of politically en vogue term, the human and the non-human as equals. So practically, a transmaterialist ethic, we can think about veganism and we can think about the right to repair. There's a big movement about getting to repair our goods and electronic goods, for example. There's lots of different things. Eco squats. This is a picture of Christiania in Copenhagen, which is a squat which I lived in for. I was invited to live in for a few months. So there's lots of different sort of examples around us which we can think of as having a transmaterialist ethic. But ultimately, it's about realizing the potency of the material world in creating and sustaining life. Catherine Youssef, who is a geographer at Queen Mary, she says this, she has a quote, "An engagement with materiality is a source of communion with the formation of a collective in which materiality is a site of political struggle and solidarity, and not a constraint or a break in the political possibilities of life. So what she's arguing is that actually material things around us can actually help us be political. It can help us push this idea of the commons. And we see this very, very clearly with the climate change movement. It's about recognizing the importance of the material world around us on a very fundamental philosophical level. Now, thirdly is minoritarianism. So thinking, being minor, kind of thinking in a minor key, if you like. Again, this is a phrase I've borrowed from Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, who's a French philosopher. So capitalism dehumanizes certain people, as I've said. It deems them dispensable and makes them resources to be consumed. Dehumanization, as we've seen recently in Palestine, is a violent process that first designates animals as disposable. It second reduces certain gendered, race, and ethnic bodies to that level of an animal, and therefore proclaims that they are disposable as well. So, as I say, we've seen politicians describe migrants as vermin or black protesters as animals. They're using very specific and loaded language to broadcast a platform of dehumanization. So an ethic of minoritarianism is fundamentally an ethical alignment with oppressed, marginalized subjects, whether we ourselves are marginalized or not, in order to understand how those oppressive institutions of capitalism work. So it's about, again, using that mutual sort of empathetic connection with minority people to say, well, okay, I want to understand the systems of your oppression so I can help create a kind of reaction to that. So this idea of the commons, I think a sort of planetary commons, if you like, is energized by this new thinking. There's a great deal of commoning practice in the global south, in marginalized communities, in non-Western religious canons, in animism, and lots of different parts and parcels all around the world, which can enliven this push for a sort of post-capitalist society. The struggle for equality has always come from the margins and from oppressed people. It's something, even from Moses' emancipation of the Jews from slavery in Egypt, through to the suffragettes gaining equal voting rights, to the continual struggle for racial justice in the modern world. Equality is never bestowed upon from above. It is always won from below. So apologies for the bad language, but decodification. So what do we mean? What do I mean by that? Well, have you done your 10,000 steps today, or is it 7,000 steps now? I don't know. Have we had our 5 fruit and veg a day? Our eyeballs and our kind of psyche is bombarded with tailored shopping lists that are sort of beamed directly into our social media feeds or wherever they are. And even as something as intimate as our sleep these days is being infiltrated by apps. You can wear smartwatches that sort of measure your REM sleep. Everything is being measured and codified and sort of packaged neatly so it can be sold. So I think to have an anti-capitalist ethic, therefore, and to indeed build a commons, is to try and resist this over-quantification and codification. And I mean over-quantification because there is some quantification which I think is important. Anyway, this active kind of decodification of things, it's an uncoupling experiences from their codification. So, for example, an algorithmic diverse codification or a digital one or otherwise. So it needs to make, so for me, post-capitalism and a commons, it needs to celebrate those atmospheres that are not codified, things that are barely perceptible, but no less powerful. And in the book, I go into a lot of arguments around architecture. I think architecture is a really good example of that. Architecture has a really important effect on us. It's not codified. You can't kind of quantify it in any way, but it's still incredibly important in how we move around the city. So there's lots of different examples. So decodification, I think, is a really important part of trying to disarm one of capitalism's most potent weapons, which is codification. Where are we now? Fifth? Yes, fifth is slowness. So capitalism is obsessed with short-term fixes, be they political terms, 4-year terms, or quarterly budget cycles, or whatever it is. But in doing so, it secures its long-term goal of expansion. So part of the appeal of capitalism is short-term gain. And so to be subversive and to be sort of to try and subvert capitalism, I think, is to almost think in the same time frame as capitalism, i.e. the long term, in order to counter it and resist the lure of the spirit of capitalism that is fueled by kind of selling excitement and instant gratification. We want stuff now. We've got to have stuff as quickly as possible. In an age of social media and 24-hour news and social movements, and Amazon deliveries that take 20 minutes or whatever it is, protest movements or social kind of anti-capitalist movements, they can appear, they can kind of coagulate, but then they can disappear just as quickly. They can be co-opted or appropriated or destroyed in increasingly rapid timeframes, simply because I think of the subconscious desire for short-term recognition, success, or the impact that sort of neoliberalism, this sort of neoliberal society infests us with. And I've seen this so many times with activists and people who perhaps have created something really interesting, which is quite subversive and a really radical piece of art or a subcultural movement, but it suddenly gets branded very quickly, or they sell out, for want of a better phrase. And it's a constant cycle, which is speeding up. So I think we can look to slow movements. We have things like slow food, slow fashion. Where I'm involved in academia, we have slow scholarship and slow cinema. The GAN here is an Australian train journey film, which takes 20 hours to watch, and it's just a camera on a train and with various slow cuts. It's a beautiful film. It's literally just a film of this 20-hour train ride, and you can just sit there and watch it, and it just washes over you. It's just amazing. Anyway, and there's loads of these kinds of things around. Slow cinema is great. So I think to be sort of post-capitalist or anti-capitalist temporally is to insist on slowness and a denial of rapidity, slickness, and hypermobility. And it's a truism, of course, but patience really is a virtue, because impatience, I think, blunts solidarity. And in the book, I use Catherine Tanner's amazing work on the spirit of new capitalism, which is that the right phrase? I've got it. Anyway, Catherine Tanner's work on the grace of God and how we need to accept it slowly. It's a very, very fantastic book. So where are we now? So sixth, failure. If you've not seen this film, Little Miss Sunshine, it's all about failure. So because success is a mantra that capitalism exudes at all times. The competitive self-interest that it's built upon means that failure is not an option unless it is a precursor to success. I'm not sure if any of you saw Rishi Sunak talking to Elon Musk the other night, but he was talking about failure. And he says, we need to learn how to fail in order to succeed. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Failure is often framed as a path to success. But to build a commons, to build a planetary commons, I think, is to utilize failure as a means of progress and resistance to the injustices of capitalism rather than its growth. So failing spectacularly in your specific goal does not mean failure of a broader movement. I've used the example of the Parisian uprisings in May in 1968, but others have used the example of the Paris Commune as well in 1878. Around then. Because both of these movements, they failed spectacularly in their immediate goal to set up a different society, but they are still considered vitally important events and movements within activist politics and scholarship. Indeed, many of the scholars which I've talked about, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Badiou, and all the ones that we read, I say we, the academic community, particularly the social sciences and the humanities, they all grew up they used May 1968 and the student uprising. That was the crucible of their political scholarship. So all of the activist philosophies and post-capitalist philosophies were forged in the fires of May in 1968 in Paris. So the energies, if you like, the energies of a movement can be transferred, or they can even be dormant, but they can be directed beyond the scope of a place and of a time if connected to radically. And I believe it was one of the Chinese scholars who was asked about they asked him and said, what was the outcome of the French Revolution? He said, well, it's too early to tell. And I think that's the mantra here. It's because for failure is not death at all, it is life. And as part of ongoing struggles, then it becomes a necessary process in making alternative futures possible. Indeed, failure is the gap, if you like, between who we are and who we could be. And hence it's an essential part of activism. And Jack Halberstrom, who's a fantastic sort of social theorist and queer scholar, writes that there is something powerful in being wrong, in losing, in failing, and that all our failures combined might just be enough if we practice them well to bring down the winner. Failure loves company. And that brings me on to love, right? And as I'm sure we're all aware, the ancient Greeks had 4 words for love, all pertaining to a different kind. This is C.S. Lewis talking here. We have eros, the erotic kind of love. We have philia, which is a friendly kind of love. That's where we get the sort of word topophilia or francophile or anglophile. We have storge, which is the sort of family love or bloodlines love, or getting adopted into a family. But then we have agape, a kind of, which is the unconditional love. And I think in Hebrew it's hesed or hased. But agape is what the Greeks called it. Now this, for me, when I talk about love in the book and in my wider writings, it's this focus here of agape, which I'm talking about, because it pertains to the love of man or humanity for God and God for humanity. But I don't think it needs to be restricted to a religious discourse, which is why I sort of class myself as a Christianist, because I think this love has far wider appeal. It denotes an unconditional love, a complete unconditionality, positive action without any desire for reciprocal reward, the kind of love that, as Christians, we are incredibly used to from the Almighty. Now, Jacques Ellul, he was a prominent Christianist, a guy who was working in the Second World War to help win the resistance, French resistance, to try and use his skills as a legal scholar to try and help Jews get different papers and everything else. So he was very involved in the French resistance. And he's written a lot about this, and he argued vociferously for a love that was more than just sort of generous giving or sympathy or pity. A radical love forces us to forego the solid, comforting ground for the relative uncertainty of poverty, of marginality, and the unstable ground. It is a love that propels human agency to be focused on collective and social justice, and it fuels, I think, all the other ethics I've talked about before, because being mutual, being material, being minor, decodifying, being slow, and indeed failure all require this unconditional love. It's an energy, if you like, it's a spirit. It's contagious and it's powerful in its subversive or its revolutionary potential, perhaps. There's a situationist called Raoul Vaneigem, who again was a guy in the Parisian. The situationists grew out of the Parisian riots, and he argues this as people who talk about revolution and class struggle without referring explicitly to everyday life, without understanding what is subversive about love, what is positive in the refusal of constraints. Such people have a corpse in their mouth, which is quite a radical kind of vision, but quite a pertinent one, I think, because in a world in which hatred has become the norm, love, I think, is indeed revolutionary. So individually, then, I think these ethical mindsets are a way to perhaps resist capitalism and kind of stop it from growing, if you like. But if we weave them together, if we bring them together, then they offer a tantalizing view of this common world, of a commons, of a planetary commons. So I haven't talked much about the virus or the COVID situation, but it came, the coronavirus sort of, the pandemic, it coming as it did from a sort of the human's clumsy intrusion into the radical unknown and unsurveyed sort of pathozoological realm, with bats in the Wuhan market. It shows just how related we are to the materiality of the world. A virus, as any doctor here will tell you, it occupies a sort of interstitial state between life and death. It's actually, a virus is a zombie. It's the original kind of idea of a zombie. Now, whether a virus attacks a human body or the global body politic, it brings the non-human and the human divide crashing down via very noticeable symptoms of illness that are indeed biological, as we saw, but also sociological and economic. So in recent years, we've seen vividly with the wildfires that choked Canada and Australia and the Amazon rainforest, the Australian continent, Europe, floods, melting roads in Delhi and everything else. And these wildfires and this heat has an intense breathlessness and rising temperatures, perhaps a planetary extension of the coronavirus, the symptoms of which include breathlessness and high temperatures. But not to be outdone by the asphyxiating symptoms of the coronavirus itself, the brutality of the police who murdered George Floyd, among others, whose final words were, "I can't breathe." A slogan that's become a rallying cry for millions of racialized people all over the world. So from wet markets, viruses, anti-racist movements, rainforests, to anti-fascist movements, to the billionaire space race, and the carbon-soaked troposphere that rains down on us, fire and floods. The COVID event, I think, has shown us how intimately connected the planet is systemically and conceptually. So I think the Capitalo Scene, as people have said, not the Anthropocene, but the Capitalo Scene, continues to usher us into this climate emergency. We're seeing this right now. And it feels, certainly to me and to many other people, to us and people in the global north in particular, who are perhaps privileged enough to have been shielded from capitalism's worst atrocities over the years, that the world is not just changing, it's rupturing. And I think that rupture is still going on. We're seeing it. What kind of world we build in the ashes of capitalism is up to us, obviously. And the activist and the novelist, Arundhati Roy, she wrote in the Financial Times, of all places, and she wrote this back in 2020. And she said this, and it's a quote which I'll leave you with. She said, "The pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice, our hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers, and our smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk lightly through with little luggage, ready to imagine another world." So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Oli, for that very powerful talk. And I hope that some of you will feel moved to put some questions to Oli via the chat. But I'll just start off with one or two points that I'd like to follow up, having read your book, Oli. Actually, just as an aside, it's very kind of you to ascribe to me those enthusiastic blogs, but actually, I think they were by my colleague Jeremy Williams, who wrote.
Yes, it was.
Very enthusiastically about the book, and it was Jeremy who first alerted me to your work. I mean, a kind of fairly simple question to start with. Towards the end of the book, you say that okay, there are 7 ethics here. It's not the one and only correct number, you say. So, what did you think about including other ethics which would support the creation of the Planetary Commons? And was there anything you kind of were perhaps intending to include but then left out?
It's a very good question. Yes, the one. So originally, decodification. My issue still is, I guess, with the way in which the richness and the experience of the world around us is shunted through a particular frame, and that frame is often quantitative. It's often a numerical frame, largely because that's what neoliberalism requires. It requires us to, because everything needs to be ranked and codified. And in urban geography, where I come from, city rankings, like being number one is really important. And so a lot of the urban scholarship is around, well, what is London doing? What is New York doing to try and be better than New York in this particular ranking? How is it actually making life better for people who live in the city? And so I was really kind of perturbed by that discomfort. I think I originally I didn't know it was numbers initially. I thought it was kind of a little more than that. I thought it was representation in general, like metaphors. and people sort of saying, oh, well, it's like this, the world is like this, or because I remember on the news someone was using these really terrible metaphors to try and justify a really bad policy, and so I originally started writing it about representations. We needed to get away from this idea of representing stuff and experience the world in all its glory, in all its fullness, live life to the fullest, I believe John 10 is it. I actually ended up, when I was writing it, I thought, actually, no, metaphors are actually very useful. They're actually incredibly important. I mean, I use them in my teaching, and they're important for an educational purpose. And so actually my discomfort, I was able to narrow it down, if you like, and focus in on numbers and quantification. And that's, to be fair, this is one of the main decodification, what I have most conflict, if you like, with people actually on the left. It's the one that a lot of people kind of say, oh, well, I get all the reason for the 6, but that one, isn't that really important? Isn't quantification really important for the left and for progressive values? And I agree to a point, but I think that it's overly done. So that was one of them. And the other one was about something about media, but I was never able to really fully articulate it properly. And I felt it was slightly hypocritical because I'm writing in a published book. So it felt a little bit, and it was, I didn't really go. It ended up sort of ballooning out to pretty much everything. But I still think that the role of media in a very broad term is very, very important. And we're seeing that in the last month, haven't we, with the various lines that we've been fed about what's happening. It's very difficult to filter out what's true and what isn't, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the narrative power has lost control of the narrative. I think the narrative is being dominated from below. I think that a lot of people are beginning to understand that a lot of this stuff that's happening, what they're saying is very, very different to the reality on the ground. But anyway, so representation and media were two that I think are still kind of there or thereabouts, but in the end I ditched them.
Right, thank you. We're beginning to get some questions in, but I'll ask one or two more while others are still formulating theirs. So one of the Green Christian projects, as I've described in writing to you, is called Joy in Enough, and I hope something of the meaning of both those words is kind of fairly clear, and so it foregrounds enoughness as a key change in how we make our world more sustainable. And I wonder, I think this is contained within your slowness and failure ethics, but is that right? And where might joy fit in?
So you're right insofar as having enough, I think, is we often don't know when we have enough, and that means different things to different people. Clearly, one of the rallying cries, one of the sloganeering around the existence of billionaires is like, how much money is enough? And when I have a visual metaphor, I have a visual representation of how much a billion is more than a million to my students, and sometimes they're genuinely surprised at how much. Anyway, so yes, you're right. There is a sense of like, how much is enough, and I think that's a really important question. But it's a geographical question and a social question, because often, clearly, people in the global north, in the southeast of England, or wherever it is, enough means very different to different kinds of people. So that's very, very important. And it is related to slowness in that way, insofar as slow fashion and a lot of the slow movements are often about limiting your consumption as well, and sort of saying, well, actually, funnily enough, I mean, this is going to sound incredibly trite, but I went on holiday in the summer, and my car got smashed by a tree. If there was a storm and it fell on it. Now we have 2 cars at home, and when we got back from the holiday, which we had to cut short because the car was totaled, we came back and we thought, actually, we don't need 2 cars. Just have one. And we got a bike, a second-hand bike, and this is sounding incredibly virtuous on me. I don't mean it to, but it's just it it struck me just personally. I was like, well, actually, we don't need two cars. One is enough. And so, I saw some stats. I mean, the average car spends 97% of its time sat on a driveway. So, anyway, I won't talk about cars, but so enough's really important. And joy, yes, there's a term that Deleuze uses, which is called jouissance. It's a French kind of term, and that is it has embedded in that a sort of it's about play. It's a kind of radical kind of acting of joy and happiness and play, which is completely unconstrained by the social world around us. These days, play is very much directed. It's kind of totalitarian in itself. If you go to a children's playground, they're all kind of cornered off and say, "You play here, you do it, under 12s, da 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 da." And so joy, experiencing joy, is often very. And we have a happiness industry, believe it or not. You go to Will Davies wrote a great book about the happiness index or the happiness industry back in 2015, 16. And I just find that incredible that there's a whole industrial complex around being happy. So it's the jouissance is a very, again, it's linked to all these other ideas, but it's about experiencing joy and the kinds of emotional states that go with that without any constraint, any institutional direction. Say, you will enjoy yourself now. You will play here now. Playtime is over now. Back to work. So it's
Thanks. And we're getting some questions now. So and my colleague Kat is helping to kind of harvest them. So one question which is about the levelers and diggers in the 17th century, and the questioner really is asking, do you think that some intentional communities such as co-housing committees now draw on the principles you've discussed, particularly the first, mutualism, as did the diggers?
Yes, I think that's very true, Catherine. I think funnily enough, the diggers, their main area was in Weybridge, which in St John's Wood in Weybridge, which ironically enough now is one of the most expensive housing and exclusive housing estates in the entire country, which I think is fairly ironic. But yes, I mean, I've been to a fair few. I was I'm writing a book at the moment. My next book is about post-capitalist cities, and I've been to a few places around the world, which I guess would be very similar. One is Slab City out in the Californian desert, where people have kind of just created an entire ecosystem of houses and water and living arrangements purely out of the desert. And I didn't like it. I was so hot. It was very, very difficult to kind of say, well, how can you live in this heat? But it was particularly hot that day, and I'm a half Polish, so I think I have a natural inclination to cold. But it was fascinating to see that people had kind of completely created this community that is designed for outcasts. It's designed for people who just don't fit in to any part of the American society. There's a lot of homeless veterans, a lot of people who, trans people of a queer orientation who just don't really feel like they fit into normal life, and they can go there and just be themselves. And yes, all the housing is very DIY, and they dig their own kind of water pits and toilets and everything else. But it has that communal aspect to it where they all get together. And there are issues. I mean, it's not completely sort of pure by any stretch of the imagination. And there's the other one I'm going to hope to go to next year is Auroville in India, which is another one. I'm sure some of you may have heard of that. But there's lots of really good examples of and Christiania, which I mentioned in the talk as well. There's lots of these kinds of places which are quite established, actually. But others will kind of crop up all over the place. But your idea of co-housing and community land trusts and things like that, I think, on a sort of more policy level, we are seeing more of them. There's a community land trust near I am as well, and they're very good, and they're very egalitarian, and they are trying to kind of bring people along with them as they go. So I think that the diggers and all that, and John and Gerard Winstanley's stuff is really, really important there. And I think I do mention, I talk about them a lot in the book.
So another question, and this is from Kat. In the same way that you advocate for slowness over quick solutions, would you advocate for resilience, which may include some redundancy, over efficiency, which can be dangerously fragile if something meant to be just in time isn't. Don't we need the luxury and security of systems that are, to a degree, inefficient?
That's a very good point. Yes, I think that's true. The just-in-time production, I mean, going back to my kind of economics days, that's one of the main innovations of the kind of the globalization era. It's one of the things that really pushed neoliberal sort of global capital into the 21st century, was this idea that you can produce things just in time. But as we saw with you remember when there was a boat stuck in the Panama Canal? Remember that? And the entire production chain just fell apart because nothing was arriving in time. Had we had built things up, and so there is a virtue in having reserves, but it comes back to enough. Like, how much of that is enough? And if we kind of could live more sustainably and live more self-sufficiently, then I think that we can have reserves nearby. We don't have to rely on a kind of global production chain. But I think what I did want to mention, resilience is a really interesting term. Now, coming where I'm from critical urban scholarship, resilience is very contested. It's quite a kind of loaded term. There's a fantastic work by a guy called Tom Slater, who's a geographer over in the States, Scottish guy, but he writes about this, and he says that, and he uses the example of after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. A lot of the rhetoric, the policy rhetoric, was like, "Oh, you need to build resilient cities. You need to make yourself more resilient." And the pushback is, "Well, why? What? That just means you can do more stuff to me. You can continue to pound me down and grind me down. Why should it be up to me to sort of try and resist these horrible, inefficient systems that you have, like flooding defense systems for only the white community in New Orleans?" So resilience is quite a difficult term, and I understand it does have different meanings in different parts of academia, or just different disciplines and different policies. But it is quite a loaded term, and I think we have to be very careful when we utilize it, because it can be used as a sort of big society sort of hammer to sort of say, "Oh, well, just be more resilient, and then we can continue to do the horrible things that we're going to continue to do. You just kind of build your own defenses, and you'll be fine." So yeah, I think we need to be very careful when we use that term.
So Claire is asking the question, what is the role, brackets, is there one, close brackets, of violent / disruptive protest in all that you've described?
Yes, this is the question which I often get asked my students and everyone else. And I think it's one of the most difficult questions, is because clearly a Christian anarchist, and my personal tendency is towards non-violence. I think that's such an important tactic, and a lot of the most important so the civil rights movement, for example, the suffragettes, and non-violence was got such an important part of their practice, but it wasn't the only part, and I think that's key. It's not easy, but I think that violence, unfortunately, sometimes is necessary. And I think that if one of the what I don't like, and what I think is bad, and what I think is a problem, is when people who are on the sidelines, for example, with Just Stop Oil or with the Black Lives Matter movement, they say, "Oh, well, I'm all for you if you do peaceful protests, but the moment you go violent, you've lost me." But the problem is, of course, is that a lot of the violence that we see in these movements often comes as a result of brutalization, usually aimed at the minorities. And so when people say, "Oh, I support non-violent protests," what they're really saying, I think, is that actually I think that I'll allow minorities to get brutalized by the police in order, therefore, for the wider movement to continue to kind of get its thing. Because even with Gandhi was there was some violence in his movement as well against the British Empire. So it's unfortunate. And I think it's the wrong word, if anything, because often it's reactionary when the civil rights movement, when they started rioting, it was in reaction to police brutality. And obviously, coming from an anarchist tradition, which, as I do, people like Simon Springer and others will argue that violence is the state has a monopoly on violence, and what activists do is resistance, and that's very different because it's reactionary. It's trying to guard against the destruction of the commons which they are building, broadly defined. So it's defending themselves, and we would, there's in the news about Israel defending itself. I mean, this is anarchists defending themselves. So I think that if we're going to talk about violence, let's talk about it in the round and say, well, actually, what is causing the violence in the first place? But we could spend the next 4 weeks talking about it. It's a very, very complicated issue, one which has no easy answers. But at its most basic, I think that they come together sometimes.
Thanks. So we've got a question from Sophie here. In your main talk, your last quote was about coronavirus being a stage from which we would either go with all our heavy luggage or choose to turn to a new life. She says, I feel we've moved on, unfortunately, with our old luggage. Is there still time to turn around and move to a new life?
Yeah, it's funny. There are people. This book was reviewed in a kind of academic arena, and there's a couple of people who are very optimistic people. They're very sort of I value their work incredibly, and they work closely as a sort of an anarcho-feminist tradition, incredibly sort of hopeful. And even they were saying, well, actually, maybe. And it is tough. You look around and you think, we've just everything's scabbed back over. But I don't know. I mean, yes, the further I get away from the book, the perhaps more pessimistic I become. But I do think that there are some things. I mean, maybe not in every realm of society, but I look at the kind of working from home thing. I mean, I know it's a very sort of glib example, but the fact that all the businesses now are sort of saying, come back, oh no, you've got to come back into work because you're not spending any money in the coffee shops and the restaurants in the city. And everyone's going, no. I like it here, thank you very much. I'm going to stay at home, and if you don't want me to do it, I'm going to change my job. So I do think there are some, and people are doing that. I mean, this obviously incredibly anecdotal evidence I'm using here, but people are doing it because actually, my well-being is improved massively from working from home, and so they're putting their well-being above GDP, and so I think that is a good thing. The climate thing is more difficult because I do think that there are, but you could look at some of the ways in which Paris and other cities have actually pushed ahead with their pedestrianization and reforestation and rewilding. A lot of golf courses, for example, were turned into parks and they haven't gone back. So these are very small, piecemeal examples, which I'm fully appreciative do not in any way affect the big question here. But I go back to that point about an event, is that it's the time frame here is perhaps less important than the actions and the energies that are being created. I don't think anyone wants it to go scab back over. I would imagine that most people in this Zoom meeting and around the world will say, actually, no, we need stuff. It's just the very, very small, powerful minority are the ones that are. So I don't think it's a lack of want. It's a lack of political kind of capabilities, and I sense that might be changing in the next few years. I mean, I know maybe not in this country, but it's anyway. But yes, I sort of flit between optimism and pessimism depending on, and I get that phrase. It's too early to tell about the French Revolution. I mean, I think that we'll look back, maybe 50 in another generation's time, we'll look back and think, yeah, no, that COVID really did change things. It's just that we don't see it right now because we're so involved in the here and the now. If we take a broader perspective, maybe, just maybe, we'll look back and think, yeah, it did change the world for the better.
Thank you. There's still questions coming in.
Yes.
So one from Colin, who's referring to Guy Standing's writing about the plunder of the commons, mostly achieved through force. So he's asking, if we refuse to exercise revolutionary force, do we have to wait for the self-induced collapse of capitalism before we have the space or freedom to rebuild with something better, apart from very local ways, which will always be repressed, contested by remaining capitalist powers? So that in part, that's I guess the response. There's a response about violence that you've already responded to. Is there anything else there? Colin, maybe I could ask you to unmute and just see if there's a follow-up to that question that you'd like to put to
well, yes, thank you, John. Hello, everybody. It's really a question. If we want systemic change, do you have to wait until a large majority of the population are Christians, or actually want to live a life of agape rather than selfishness? I mean, we are image of God people, but we're broken, and there's a lot of the brokenness manifesting itself in our current systems. So how do we actually achieve that that level of change, that large scale change that has a big impact, as opposed to having a little co-housing project? And I don't deny the value of all of those things, but small scale things, but they will continually be repressed. You only have to look at the way the Bank of England jumps on people who try to institute local currencies, for example. And that's a capitalist brute force of the state, basically. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that, this is, again, a question which, if I knew if there was a simple answer to it, perhaps I'd be far more famous than I am. But I think that it's the fundamental issue here is about whether we kind of wait for capitalism to wither away, and what will that look at? What will that look like? I mean, I'm bound to say this because I am an educator, but I think education is very important here. I think that getting people to understand why capitalism is acting the way it is, and how the systems that we can put in place to counter that are far better. Now, I think that the majority of people would respond to that, because the majority of people at the moment are responding to the people that control the narrative, which is those, the billionaire press owners and everyone else. So there's an education from a kind of official perspective and an education from a media perspective, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about media in the book, which I never really properly managed to formulate it, because I think that communication and media and education is a really important tool here. Because actually, if people were to understand that capitalism is doing this to them, rather than just sort of being told that it's doing them good, then I think actually it would help. And I think that there's a sense that people just need to be exposed to it. The mutual aid movement in COVID. I mean, this is the project I did. I wrote a manifesto about a manifesto of mutual aid. I spent 18 months going around the country looking at various mutual aid groups that sprung up, and they were consisting of people who were generally middle class, generally kind of middle of the road, perhaps kind of right leaning people. And they were going, do you know what? I didn't realize there was so much poverty on my doorstep. Oh, I didn't realize if I just did this. Oh, I didn't realize the immigrant down the road is actually quite a nice guy. And so they became incredibly political spaces, and there was a consciousness raising happening here. There was a lot of awakening just by simply being with people, simply engaging in a mutual aid network. And so it's about experience. I mean, this isn't an easy thing to do, but it's about exposing people to that through communication, through media, through actual experience. But it's once that connection happens, then the rest almost takes care of itself. So but at the moment, the media is obviously controlled by a very select few people, which we need to change very, very quickly. One of the things Corbyn was, I think that the first thing that anybody needs to do to get into anyone remotely considering themselves left gets into power, they need to dismantle the media complex immediately, get rid of billionaire press owners and the relationship between the government and the media. That needs to be. That's why the Leveson inquiry and all that is such an important part of what's going on. We just need to drive a massive wedge between that. Sorry, I'll got my soapbox there, but that's
Have you got time for a couple more questions?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just go back and find it. Jonathan is asking, do you believe the neoliberal era is now firmly behind us, and what is going to take its place?
If you believe people like Will Davis and some others, they argue that neoliberalism is dead and we've kind of entered a post-truth era and the era of populism. I don't really believe that. I think neoliberalism still haunts us. It's changed very much so. I think that, but then ultimately, neoliberalism is just a sort of word we use for a collection of processes and people's kinds of ways in which they've tried to change the institutions. Ultimately, it's about making sure that we still, well, for them anyway, making sure that they can still control the population in such a way that money continues to be funneled up to the top. And so whether you call it neoliberalism or populism, I still think there are key tenets of that. So like individualism, kind of corporate power over state power. And so I think there are some key facets there which are kind of interchangeable. Neoliberalism, people call it zombie neoliberalism or post-neoliberalism. And ultimately, just through our own experiences, we know that the world still operates in a particular way. And I think that whatever we call it, helps to kind of help us analyze it, but I don't think it changes the sort of conditions of what it is. So I take your point, but I'm kind of agnostic about whether we have or haven't. So that's a kind of bit of a cop-out answer. Sorry.
Thank you. There's a question from Daniel here. Minoritarianism makes me think of the choices of Jesus, Francis of Assisi, and many others to identify with those rejected or broken by structures of power. Most of us in Green Christian are from quite privileged backgrounds. So what voices from the margins are we most in need of hearing? And how might we begin to align ourselves with them more daringly?
Wow, what a great question, Daniel. That's a beautifully open and honest question. I think that I could give you the reading list from that's just a drop in the ocean. But I think that there's some fantastic. I've been reading a lot of Bell Hooks' work recently around love. Some of the work from the Black feminist tradition, Audre Lorde's, Angela Davies. There's some fantastic work being done in the Black feminist tradition, which goes back a number of decades, which I think is really important. Audre Lorde's, in fact, just going back to one of the other questions about capitalism withering, she's got this one of her essays is "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And so we have to build our own houses with our own tools, which is a sort of very feminist, anarchic kind of idea. But I think they're important. Those are the kinds of voices which I'm reading, and I think that they energize a lot of what has happened thus far. I guess in the current conjuncture, a lot of sort of Palestinian scholars and kind of films and artwork that they've produced could be really interesting. But there's so much out there. But start with some of the Black radical tradition. Fred Hampton's on the Black Panthers stuff as well. I find that that's very, it energizes a lot of what we consider in this part of the world anyway to be kind of activism, radical activism.
There are still quite a few questions, but I think we're going to have to begin to round things off. I've got to find.
I just saw
yes,
Colin.
Absolutely.
The book, and I've got it.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you a final question. What gives you hope in the current situation we're in?
Well, what gives me hope is the communities that I've been lucky enough to meet, the people who actually create their own systems of, the people who create systems in which they secure their own destiny, if that's the right word, future. there's so much of it around. Like I say, that's where my research has taken me, into these communities who, under extreme pressures like the searing heat of the Californian desert and the neoliberal society of the United States, have created a thriving community which was great fun and loads of, and and so they are there. These groups are hopeful. They're small, they are diffuse, but they are beautiful when you consider where they've come from and how they're carving out a joyous living, actually, a joy in enough. Quite ironically, quite poetically, they are actually, creating a system or creating a society which is enough, which is plentiful, and which is joyous, and that gives me hope. Yeah. So in a world which is being crushed at the moment by a kind of geopolitical forces of depression, I think that we can look into the world around us, and they are there. We just need to. There's a great phrase by it's in Italo Calvino's book, 1970, Invisible Cities, is it? Where he goes around and he's got this phrase, and he says, we need to look for in a world of inferno, we need to look for the not inferno and make it endure and give it space. So I think that says it better than I ever could.
Oli, thank you so much for giving your time this evening. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to show your book again and just say who publishes it?
Yes, so it's Polity Press. I mean, it's hardback, paperback. I mean, it's don't go to Amazon, please. Just go directly to Polity. I do have a PDF if people can't afford it. I mean, it's only like, I think it's £8 or £9. But if that's too much, which in some ways it is, and in many ways I'm actually quite happy to sort of surround it, because it is against capitalism, right? So so if you want a PDF copy, please I'll drop an email. I'll give a copy to John and he can circulate it, or just go online and buy it. But not Amazon, please.
Great. Okay, well, thank you from all of us.